Hey everyone, Miss Portelli here. So today we're going to be talking about the process of photosynthesis. You guys should already be familiar with this word when we started to look at the different organelles within cells. This word would have been associated with the organelle, the chloroplast, which we know we can find in lots of different eukaryotic cells, in particular plant cells. So why is photosynthesis, this process that occurs in chloroplasts, so important? Well, it has to do with a special molecule that we have talked a little bit about, glucose. So glucose is one of the main sugars that all living organisms need to consume because they need to consume glucose to help them create ATP or energy for their cells. Now, for us as what we would term as animal cells, we are unable to manufacture glucose ourselves. We actually need to eat glucose or consume it from an outside source. That might be by eating another animal, for example, like chicken or lamb or beef or something like that, or it might be from eating other plants. So plant cells, carrots, potatoes, vegetables, fruits, that sort of thing. Organisms that can perform photosynthesis, though, are really lucky because they have the inbuilt mechanism of creating their own glucose through the process of photosynthesis. So plants can actually make their own glucose themselves using their chloroplast, which perform the process photosynthesis. And they do that really basically by trapping sunlight energy and then going through a series of chemical reactions to produce that chemical energy of glucose. That glucose can then be used by their cells or cells of other organisms that are eating them to manufacture some ATP or energy for the cell. I've included this diagram on the screen here just as a little reminder of what a chloroplast would look like or where it would be located within the cell. So what you're looking at is obviously a whole leaf structure here, and then we've got a cross section of our leaf here made up of many cells, zooming into a single cell here, and inside that single cell we can see a very large green vacuole in the middle, as well as lots of little dark green chloroplasts around the edge. We then zoom into the chloroplast to look at it on the side here. The other thing that I would like to remind you of, in case you are unaware, is that our chloroplasts also contain a special pigment known as chlorophyll. If you're not familiar with that word, it is quite important word that we do need to remember because chlorophyll is the green pigment within plants that is responsible for trapping sunlight. If a plant is unable to trap sunlight, it's unable to go through the process of photosynthesis, and then it will not be able to produce that glucose it requires. All right, now let's have a look at, where these chemical reactions in photosynthesis are actually taking place. So the image on the screen here that you're looking at is another zoomed in look at a chloroplast. So that whole thing that we're looking at here is a chloroplast. There are some important parts of the chloroplast structure that you need to be aware of. The first part that you need to be aware of is these little green discs that you're seeing stacked on top of each other. So each one of those green discs is known as a thylakoid. If we have a bunch of thylakoids stacked on top of each other, we can now refer to that stack as a grana. And the last part of the chloroplast that is really important for you to be able to recognize is the space that surrounds all these thylakoids or these grana and fills the rest of the chloroplast. That space there is referred to as the stroma. So those three parts are probably the most important parts of the chloroplast that you need to be aware of. And the reason that they are the most important parts is because they are where the reactions for photosynthesis take place. There are actually two chemical reactions that we need to focus on in photosynthesis. The first chemical reaction, known as the light-dependent reactions, occurs in the thylakoid membranes, or you can say in a stack of grana, that's also acceptable. And the reason that it occurs there is these thylakoids, the discs, actually contain the chlorophyll that's going to trap the sunlight. So stage one of our reaction occurs in the thylakoid membrane because chlorophyll is found there. Stage two of the photosynthesis reaction is called the light-independent reactions, and that's occurring in the stroma, so the space surrounding the thylakoids and the grana. We're now going to have a closer look at what exactly is happening in both of these reactions and how we go from having water and carbon dioxide with our sunlight and converting that into our glucose, oxygen, and some water as well. Let's start with the light-dependent reaction, so stage 1 of photosynthesis. And just as the name of this stage describes, it's dependent on sunlight for it to occur. And like I said, the reason it's dependent on sunlight for it to occur is because it's occurring in the thylakoid membranes, or the grana, those discs, and those discs contain the chlorophyll, that green pigment that's responsible for absorbing the sunlight. So the chlorophyll is going to absorb that sunlight, and the whole purpose of absorbing that sunlight is to use that sunlight energy to help split some water molecules into hydrogens and oxygens. Okay, you guys will all be familiar that the chemical formula for water is H2O. So that sunlight energy is used by the chlorophyll to essentially split that into just having hydrogens and the oxygens. Okay. In the process of splitting that water into hydrogens and oxygens, the chloroplast actually produces some ATP. Remember, ATP is the energy that cells use to do all the things they need to do, really. Okay, so it's the energy that the cell uses in everything that it does. So right now you probably noticed that we actually haven't produced any glucose. And that's because you don't produce the glucose until stage 2. So in stage 1, the light-dependent stage, we're splitting water into hydrogens and oxygens and producing some ATP, some energy for the cell to keep using. What's going to happen with those three things is the oxygens that have been split from the water are actually no longer needed in this reaction and are released from the chloroplast. Those oxygens might go somewhere else in the cell and be used in another chemical reaction, or if they're no longer required by the cell at all, they'll actually leave the cell entirely and be released into the environment surrounding it. That's kind of where we get that phrase that plants breathe in carbon dioxide, but they breathe out oxygen. Well, the breathing out oxygen is because of this part of the photosynthesis reaction. All right, so the oxygen leaves the chloroplast. So what's happening to the ATP and those hydrogen ions, or those hydrogen molecules that are left? Well, the ATP is going to be used in stage 2, and those hydrogen molecules are also going to be used in stage 2. To do that, they actually need to attach to special electron carriers or hydrogen carriers, and those hydrogen carriers are known as NADP. Other than that, you don't need to know anything about what they do. Just think of them as like a little taxi that's going to pick up these hydrogens and drive them to the location that they need to go to. So ATP is going to be used in stage 2, and the hydrogens are going to be used in stage 2. Those hydrogens are going to jump in their little carrier taxis known as NADP, and the NADP is going to carry them or transport them to stage 2 of the photosynthesis reaction. So in the second stage of photosynthesis, the light-independent stage, as the name suggests, this means that light is not required. So it does not need to use sunlight in this part of the reaction. I'll just remind everyone that in stage 1 of the reaction, some ATP was produced, and we also had those hydrogen molecules attaching to our NADP carriers, our little taxis, to transport them to this second stage. And the reason that they need to be transported is because that first stage was occurring in the thylakoids, those stacks, whereas the second stage, the light-independent stage, is occurring in the stroma, the space surrounding it. So they do need to move a short distance. So the whole purpose of this second stage, the light-independent stage, is to actually finish producing glucose. And the way that that's going to happen is the ATP from reaction 1 is going to be used to power this reaction. Okay, so it does require some energy for it to occur. That energy, ATP, comes from stage 1 and is used in stage 2. We're also going to use those hydrogens that were carried from stage 1 to help build our glucose molecule. So you can see the chemical formula for glucose down here, and it's got 12 hydrogens in it, so those hydrogens are definitely going to come in handy. You'll also notice that the chemical formula for glucose also contains some carbons and some oxygens. They need to come from somewhere. Well, guess what? They come from carbon dioxide, which the plant would have absorbed from its environment. So we're using hydrogens and carbon dioxide, and it's being powered, this reaction is being powered by some ATP. A whole bunch of chemical reactions occur, and the end product is producing that glucose. Okay, a final summary of the overall reaction of photosynthesis. So in the light-dependent reaction, so stage 1 of photosynthesis, that's occurring in the thylakoid membrane. So these green stacks that we're seeing here, or these green discs, are the thylakoids. It's occurring in the membranes there where the chlorophyll is found. So the chlorophyll needs to absorb light. We need some water molecules to enter the chloroplast, and that light energy that was absorbed by the chlorophylls are going to break that water molecule into the hydrogens and the oxygens, which are released from the chloroplast. Those hydrogens attach to our little taxis, our NADPs, and are transported to stage 2. In that first reaction, some ATP or energy is also produced, and we can see that being transported to our second stage of photosynthesis as well. So in our second stage of photosynthesis, we know it as the light-independent reaction. It can also be called the Calvin cycle though, but in our light-independent reaction, we need the energy from stage 1, the hydrogens from stage 1, and we also need some carbon dioxide from outside the chloroplast for this reaction to occur. The reaction does occur, and we end up producing our sugar or our glucose molecule at the end. A reminder that the chemical formula for glucose is C6H12O6. Sometimes it's a little bit easier to recognize where those parts have come from. So the C's, the carbons, and the O's, the oxygens, they've both come from the carbon dioxide that's been entering the chloroplast, whereas those hydrogens, the H's, have come from this arrow here. So the hydrogens that have come from stage 1. If a diagram's really not your thing, I've also included a summary table that summarizes all the inputs and outputs of each of the 2 stages of the reaction and where they're occurring. So I don't really mind which one you use. Please do remember that in any case, if you do have any questions, you approach your teacher and make sure that you are asking for help so that we can make sure you're up to speed as quickly as possible. Until next time, thanks guys.